The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Welcome to a discussion with Neil Miller. I'm Dave Lindeman of the Hennepin County Library, and today we'll be talking to Neil Miller, author of In Search of Gay America and Out in the World. And today we'll be talking about his most recent book, Out of the Past, Gay and Lesbian History from 1869 to the Present. Welcome, Neil.
Thank you, Dave.
It's good to have you on this show here. I'd like to know about how you went about researching this book. It's quite a comprehensive history of gay and lesbian history from quite a large period of time.
Yeah. Well, one of the I'm not a historian, I'm a journalist by background, and there's been a sort of, after such a long period in which gay history was either suppressed or invisible, within the last 10 or 15 years, just like with women's history or black history, there's really been this kind of explosion of writing about gay and lesbian history. And so what I tried to do was but it's generally been kind of small scale. Somebody will write about World War II, for example, or the Oscar Wilde trial. You know, nobody has really done a big overview. So what I tried to do was kind of do as much reading as possible and a lot of this new research and kind of basically pick out the most telling stories and the most interesting things and put it together. It's a complicated business to sort of write about gay and lesbian history, especially when you're dealing with the late 19th century, let's say, where it's not at all clear who might be gay or who might not. One of the main points in the book, the book begins in 1869, which is the first time the word homosexuality ever appeared in print, which was in Germany. And it never really appeared in print in English until the 1890s. And that sort of underscores that while sexual behavior has been, in existence from time immemorial, the sense of an identity of being a gay man or a lesbian is a relatively new phenomenon and really begins at the end of the 19th century. So a lot of the people during that period, it's just really unclear. They wouldn't call themselves gay.
Right,
Walt Whitman wouldn't say that he was gay. Mm-hmm. Oscar Wilde did talk about the love that dare not speak its name, but really he was the first in that sense. So it's very hard, what's your standard of proof? How do you, indicate that someone should be in a gay history or is gay or lesbian? And it can be, that's kind of a challenge of this.
I noticed during the course of reading the book, and of course other books as well, that your main sources, or many of your sources of information, were people like Oscar Wilde and Walt Whitman, who actually wrote books that you could read and read into.
Right.
And perhaps letters of Eleanor Roosevelt or something of that nature. And the other sources were secondhand, like you mentioned in terms of black history and women's history, the people who wrote about them were white Christian men of European heritage. So you're kind of getting this filter of information about what might have happened or what was real in their eyes, their vision.
Well, here you get into some other problems. People would at a certain point late in his life, Whitman denied, for example, that he was ever alluding to homosexuality in his work. There was a lot of censorship that went on. For example, Emily Dickinson's letters to her, I think to her sister-in-law, which are these very effusive sort of 19th century letters, were, toned down by someone. And this kind of thing is very common. And for someone to admit that they were homosexual or had erotic relations with members of the same sex was to put themselves in some danger of social disapproval or of losing their job, whatever. So you kind of sometimes have to almost read between the lines, and it gets very difficult to do that.
I'm sure. One of the things I thought was really interesting was that during that period, the late 19th century mostly, was that there was a fair amount of homosexual activity, but people didn't really, the common person didn't use the word, didn't really have a true understanding of what it meant, and so they weren't afraid of being labeled as a gay person or a homosexual. So where today I know there are a lot of men who are extremely fearful of being labeled, so they are cultivating this macho image of themselves. Back then they weren't afraid of, like, you mentioned renting out part of their bed to an overnight traveler, because I mean it was just done and no one thought or gave it a second thought. It's very interesting.
Yeah, it's just in some ways it's a kind of a more innocent period, you know, before Freud and before psychology, and there weren't these strong social categorizations of, you know, this person is gay, this person is straight. I mean, you have, for example, women couples, the Boston marriages, as they're called, in which two women would live together in a lifetime partnership, you know, never marry. An example of that was the novelist Willa Cather, for example, or Jane Addams, who founded the settlement house movement in the United States. But people didn't really think, or maybe they thought, you know, these relationships were basically accepted, and they weren't stigmatized in any way, which is completely different than in our own era. And as psychology started to come along, people were more aware of this. So it was a little, and there were these kind of categories and classifications, and you didn't want to be classified as
Well, you mentioned that too. There was kind of a medical turning point where everything turned into medical terminology, and at that point there were sicknesses and illnesses and psychological disorders that categorized people.
Yeah, that's the writings of the sexologists, and you know, everything became, you know, given a very negative spin and put in a medical category. Therefore, the word homosexual, and that was one of the main objections to that word, because it seemed so clinical or so medical. But then, I mean, you get efforts to change homosexuals into heterosexuals, which American psychiatry bought into really up until the 1970s, and some people still believe in it.
Yes.
But you had to have the categories first. So nobody was trying to change people, you know, from gay to straight in 1860, because there wasn't any gay and there wasn't any straight, exactly. Not in the way, not as an identity that really defined you.
Right. You've written several other books. You've traveled the entire United States, interviewed hundreds of people. You've traveled the world and interviewed hundreds of people. Cultures, Japan, China, European and Russian, all these different...
Egypt, South Africa.
Right.
You name it, I was there.
Go on and on, you've been there. Is homosexuality a Western concept, Western European concept? How is homosexuality perceived in some other cultures?
Right. You know, no, that's a very interesting. That was one of the more interesting aspects of writing my previous book, Out in the World. In that, I mean, clearly, homosexual sexual activity goes on in all cultures, and you know, throughout history. But the sense, again, of this. Of gay identity, of someone really making this a major part of their identity, of two men or two women really living together in a fairly open way. This idea of gay community, of gay political movements is very much a Western concept. I mean, that sort of comes out of this shift in the late 19th century, this sort of medicalization and all that. But for example, I was in a country like Egypt, where there was absolutely no sense of a gay identity. I mean, there's a lot of, particularly among men in Egypt, there's a lot of sex that goes on. There's a lot of what we would call bisexuality in the culture. But when I would tell people, oh, I'm writing this book on gays and lesbians around the world, people had no idea what I was talking about. You know, they just didn't have this sense of gay identity or lesbian identity. And I would argue that some of the sense of gay identity in our own culture comes out of the kind of the stigma and the opposition to homosexuality. which caused people to be more aware of it, to see themselves in a distinct way, and eventually to kind of organize and fight for their rights is kind of an extension of that. But yet in a country like Japan, where there's in Japanese culture, there's been a lot of accepted homosexual behavior. The samurai and all this, and it's sort of been part of Japanese tradition. So there hasn't historically been any real stigma. There are no laws against it. So there's a very weak sense of homosexual identity in terms of
I mean, it might be interpreted to them personally as a behavior rather than.
Right. Yeah, so they all get Japanese gay men, what we would consider gay men, they all get married. They would not think that their relationships with other men kind of defined them in any way or made them different or weird. Now, it's beginning to shift. I mean, there's more Western concepts sort of entering these societies, and particularly a country like Japan, where there's so much communication with the West, people have a lot more money to spend, so two men or two women could actually live together outside of the family, or they're beginning to be able to do that because some of the strong, obviously marriage is still a major factor in Japanese culture, much more than here, but there's a little more flexibility in the society which permits kind of more of our sense, a Western sense of homosexuality to emerge.
Right. One thing that's fairly apparent is that male homosexuality and female homosexuality really have two very different paths in terms of their evolution and coming of age. Female sexuality or bisexuality and homosexuality seems to be very closely tied to feminism, where the male concept isn't.
Right. Well, I guess you could say, since in the post-Stonewall period, in the 70s and 80s, it was certainly the women's movement. Lesbianism was really tied to the women's movement, but originally, I mean, when these sexologists were classifying sexuality, they sort of they gave these very kind of stereotypical categories to both men and women. So the origins of identity are similar, and the trial of Radcliffe Hall, she's the author of The Well of Loneliness, which is a famous lesbian novel in the 1920s in England, sort of gave a public face to lesbianism, kind of in the same way that the Wilde trial did for gay men back in the 1890s. So I think the patterns have not been that dissimilar, but I think it changes, as you say, in the United States after Stonewall, which is the big dividing point, the beginning of the gay liberation movement and the lesbian liberation movement, where the women's movement was so strong here that lesbians tended to identify much more with women trying to find their, as a stronger role for themselves in society, and felt they had less in common with gay men. And I think that's beginning to shift again, or has shifted in the 80s.
And yet in other cultures, feminism or the power of women and their ability to control their lives is closely tied, I think.
Oh, it is, yeah. And I mean, I found in countries where there was very little freedom or independence for women, that there was almost no public sign of lesbianism. That you really, for lesbian couples to live together, let's say, I mean, you have to have some ability to make some money. You have to be able to live independently from men, and women have to have some status in the society.
Right, in order to have the ability to move on out.
And where they don't have it, there's just, it's really not possible for a lesbian identity really to emerge.
In this country, I think there were some humorous things in the book, and also some really surprising elements that I enjoyed. One was the great Western cowboy myth that we've all enjoyed in movies and in novels, and it's a very pervasive myth in literature and elsewhere about the Western cowboy. Could you describe some of your findings?
Well, I mean, cowboy culture was an all-male society, and there's actually been a fair amount of documentation of homosexuality in other all-male societies, if you want to call it, like among pirates. There's some book that was written, and there's not much that's really known about homosexuality in the American West. And one of the things I found, one of my sort of pieces of original research, or not original research, but this book that I discovered in the called Reminiscences of a Ranchman, which is hiding in the back shelves of a library at Harvard University, talked about a cowboy bar in Nebraska in 1882 at the terminus of the Texas Trail, where there were no women around, and one of the cowboys decided to remedy the situation and goes and dresses in female garb. He still got his chaps on, and dances with all these men, and sort of becomes the belle of the ball for the evening, which is sort of an amusing story. What it means, we don't really know, but it just opens up the possibilities in terms of you're thinking, well, what really did go on in these all-male societies, and was there a lot of homosexual behavior? Again, nobody's going around saying
you really don't know for sure.
They're gay.
But you said there might have been a strong attraction because of that identification, at least subconsciously perhaps, to draw a few men out west.
Yeah, to go out west. Well, and of course, Native American tribes really, had this whole category called the Berdache, which were men who dressed and lived as women, and often married, men, and had roles in tribal ceremonies, and
a really honored position.
Yeah, a really honored position, which is completely the opposite from our culture. But it was not viewed. It's really a transgender identity more than anything. Right. I mean, it's not like one person had to be in the female role always, even though he was a biological male. So
you have another interesting story in the book about Weewa goes to Washington.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And I wish you'd tell that for the audience.
Well, Weewa was an example of he was a Zuni Indian from, I guess it's Arizona or New Mexico, and this is in the 1880s, and he was a Berdache, so he's a man who lives as a woman, dresses as a woman, and there was an anthropologist who was studying the tribe named Matilda Cox Stevenson, and she invited Weewa to Washington. Well, she'd always believed he was a woman, in fact. And so Weewa came to Washington and did kind of a performance at the National Theater, and was demonstrating Zuni weaving and different Zuni Indian techniques, and actually met the president, Grover Cleveland, became friends with the Speaker of the House, and everyone thought that he was a woman. And then there's a very funny article from the Washington Star, I think, or a Washington newspaper, describing that a lot of the audience at one of his lectures were really disappointed because Weewa was not kind of a Pocahontas-like, kind of very feminine woman, but in fact was quite tall and broad-shouldered. And but no one doubted for a moment that Weewa was
kind of the spoof on Washington.
Right, spoof on Washington. And
in terms of, well, our nation in its early years, and the world too, what effect do you think Western civilization, particularly the Christian influence and colonization of various other countries, has had on, homosexuality or gay and lesbian activity in those cultures?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, initially it had a very negative effect, that there were lots of societies where homosexual behavior, at least, was rather accepted, or at least it wasn't condemned. Egypt is an example of that. It's true in some Asian cultures as well, and certainly among Native Americans is another example. And when the Europeans came with their very rigid notions of how people should behave sexually, there was a lot of suppression of this kind of thing. And an example is the Berdache, who were completely destroyed and died out as a result of, white Americans moving west. I think what's interesting is that in the last 20 years, with the arrival of feminism and gay liberation, Western influence has actually had quite a different effect on countries, so that, American teachers going over to Japan, for example, to teach English really helped in the creation of a Japanese gay community and gay movement for the first time. So I think in our own time, the West is kind of, is spreading these notions of sexual categories and gay identity and gay community. But initially, the contact of Christianity in the West with a lot of traditional cultures where homosexuality was either part of the culture or was accepted was highly negative, and there was just a lot of suppression.
Yes, I remember several incidents in, well, the Indians, Native Americans that you mentioned, and, well, Japan is another example, I think, where
although it was never colonized, but still there was...
It's not colonized, right.
Still there was Western influence.
The influence was such that their own cultures be turned on themselves, basically. Right. And they were, turned on themselves and squelched their own native traditions because they believed that the Western paradigm was better and should be modeled after.
And in a lot of those cultures today, you'll find them arguing that, homosexuality comes from the West. It never existed in our culture. And,
right.
Which is certainly not true.
Now, in our nation, there's many horrible stories in your book, too. Nazi Germany, the terrible things that happened in the concentration camps. One of the longest things that, or worst things I can think of in recent history was the McCarthy era in this country. Could you describe some of the more interesting things?
Right. Yeah, that was. Obviously, the major enemy of the McCarthy period was communism.
Right.
But certainly, and that was kind of the enemy within and without. But another enemy within was homosexuality, and it was during this period that gay men particularly were seen as security risks, and there were a lot of firings, purging of the State Department, and firings of gay civil servants in Washington, and a real sort of witch hunt mentality in terms of fears of gay and lesbians. And it was also at this time there were a lot of police raids on gay bars, so it was kind of a national sort of repression. And it's interesting, there's a lot of gay baiting that goes on. McCarthy's chief counsel, Roy Cohn, was gay, although certainly in the closet at that time, but he was quite happy to use homosexuality against other people to destroy their careers. But then it sort of got used against him as well during the Army McCarthy period. So it was a rather nasty sort of political atmosphere, to say the least. And out of this came the earliest gay organizations, the Daughters of Bilitis, which was the first lesbian organization in America, and the Mattachine Society, which was the first gay male organization. And these organizations were very small and kind of underground, and people didn't use their real names, and they didn't really have a huge impact. But it was really the beginning of gay political organizing in this country. And of course, J. Edgar Hoover plays a role there, and his another person who it seems was probably gay, but really cracked down on these gay groups and infiltrated them, and would write down the license numbers of anybody who went to a Mattachine Society meeting or convention. There was really a lot of repression.
The witch hunts of the era persisted much longer than the McCarthy era.
Right. Yeah, even after McCarthy was condemned, censored by the Senate or whatever, the whole mentality continued, especially towards homosexuals. And the post office was would check people's letters to, kind of trying to ferret out homosexuals.
Gays in the military has been an issue in the past several years.
Right.
I'd like you to talk about the World War II Lesbian Army Corps.
The Lesbian Army Corps? Well, in his book, Conduct Unbecoming, Randy Schultz came up with a statistic that 80% of the WACs in World War II were lesbian, which sounds a little exaggerated. But in fact, during World War II, it was the first time women really had served in the American military in any great numbers. Maybe there had been some in World War I. But in any event, married women were not allowed to join the WACs. And I think if you were pregnant, you were immediately thrown out. So it really was, there were large numbers of lesbians who did join up, and a lot of women who realized they were lesbians, I think, once they got in. And in his book Coming Out Under Fire, Alan Barabee, who's one of those gay historians that I was referring to earlier, did lots of interviews with lesbians about that. And it was kind of an important stage in the development of a lot of women in America kind of realizing they were lesbians, being out of their normal circumstances where they were actually in situations where they could relate to other women. And during World War II, that was really the first time that the question, "Are you gay?" was ever asked in the military. It was not asked of lesbians, however, until late in the war, when there was a complaint by the mother of a lesbian WAC about goings-on at Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, which the mother somehow got wind of. So whereupon they tried to kind of ferret out lesbians as well. Although there weren't any mass witch hunts of lesbians during the... Well, there were hearings at Fort Oglethorpe, actually. I guess that's a kind of a witch hunt. But almost all the gay people who were discharged from the Army during World War II were men. But at least during the war years, there seemed to have been a very disproportionate number of lesbians who served.
We have just a couple of minutes left. And your book ends on a very, very optimistic note in terms of how far gays and lesbians have come, the notoriety in the media, just the mentioning of the issues in the media has been a big step or leap of progress. But what do you see happening in the future in terms of gay and lesbian issues, rights, whatever?
Right.
I know that in a historical concept or context, things have flip-flopped overnight, and one day there would be, complete acceptance, and it's seemingly overnight it would be criminalization, criminalization of the whole idea. So. With the radical right the way it is,
right.
What do you see happening?
When I wrote that, I wrote that last chapter before the 1994 election, so I was very more optimistic. I mean, I really think there has been tremendous progress, especially since the gay liberation movement started here in '69, that it's easy to lose sight of that. And I think there have been really a lot of gains and stuff. But I do find the more conservative mood in the country on social issues and the strength of the Christian right as possibly putting a real brake on this. I mean, I tend to, I do think there's just been a lot of progress that's sort of, there's a momentum that I don't really think can be halted. There's just such a strong sense of themselves among gays and lesbians, and a strong political movement, and more people much more open about talking about the whole thing, and society is much more, the subject is being discussed much more than it ever was, in films and books and newspapers. So I think there's really a tide that can't quite be stopped. But I do think the new strength of the Christian right is a real threat to the progress of gays and lesbians.
Well, let's hope the tide continues in the right direction. It's been a pleasure speaking with you,
thank you,
Neil
David. I
Miller.
enjoyed it.
And thank you for joining us with a discussion with Neil Miller.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.